This is about the book, The Case for Christ, not the movie. I know nothing about the movie. I had just finished reading the book. While I was reading it, I was writing down complaints and critiques that came to mind. I didn't read it with the purpose of making a critique video about it, but after I had a few notes written down, it seemed only natural. For the most part, my critiques aren't about specific passages in the book, though some of them are. So, The Case for Christ is a Christian apologetics book. The author, Lee Strobel, used to be a journalist in Chicago. He says that he was an atheist, or at least some type of skeptic. Then his wife became a Christian, and he undertook an investigation to find out if there was any truth to Christianity. He seems to strongly think that there is. Lee Strobel goes through a different topic and type of evidence each chapter, interviewing a different Christian scholar each time. Like, the eyewitness evidence. Can the biographies of Jesus be trusted? Or the documentary evidence. Were Jesus' biographies reliably preserved for us? Or the scientific evidence? Does archaeology confirm or contradict Jesus' biographies? I have 24 points to hit on. This will be a long video, but there are timestamps in the description if you want to skip around. Feel free to use this video as more of a podcast than a video. I'm not going to put very much on the screen while I'm talking, aside from some quotes and parenthetical statements here and there, so you won't miss very much if you only listen to it. So, The Case for Christ is not convincing. Here's why. More than half of this book is Lee Strobel throwing softballs at his interviewees, and those softballs aren't even really important or relevant critiques of Christianity. You got the pitcher throwing purposefully easy shots that he knows the batter is prepared for, acting like the batter's success is proof that the batter's team is the best at baseball. But wait a minute, the pitcher is on the same team. Lee Strobel is pretending like he's a skeptic. He's trying to make it seem like there's honest investigation going on here. There's not. It's just a guy who's committed to belief in Jesus writing a book about why you should believe in Jesus, which would be fine. You can write books trying to convince the reader that you're right. That's what nearly every nonfiction book is. The reason why it's not fine for this book is because he's trying to make his position out to be the opposite of what it actually is. It's trying to be written from the angle of, I was a skeptic until after all these interviews I did. Now I believe in God, and you should too. But it's clear from the language of the interviews that he agreed with the interviewee's side while interviewing them. He was trying to play devil's advocate, but didn't probe deeply enough to successfully pull it off, which casts a whole lot of doubt on the timeline of his story. He says he started investigating The Case for Christ after his wife became Christian. That was in 1979, but this book was first published in 1998. Did he really conduct these interviews in 1979 and then wait 20 years to make a book out of them? Or did he conduct these interviews in 1998 when he was writing this book, years and years after he'd already become Christian? It seems like he became a Christian and then started investigating. If that's the way it happened, say it like that. Except he doesn't, because he wants to win over atheists. He'd lose the majority of his atheist audience, though to be honest, I might be the only one, if he just admitted that he took a leap of faith and then tried to rationalize it after the fact. So, ultimately, trust in him as a reliable scientific narrator is lost, and he comes off as disingenuous. At the end of the book, Lee Strobel clarifies that these interviews were indeed done many years after he already became a Christian. I guess I'm glad that he was straightforward about it eventually, but why not explicitly say it from the start? It smacks of deception, but maybe unintentional deception. The language about this in the beginning of the book was much less clear than at the end of the book, as well as the timeline. Regardless, the main problem here is that he's trying to portray himself as a skeptic when really he's not. Verifying historical accuracy is not the same as verifying claims of divinity. Being right about 90% of what you're saying doesn't imply that the final 10% is also right. Consider this example. Donald Trump was born in 1946. He was the 45th president of the United States. He was the son of God. The first two sentences are true. That doesn't mean the third sentence has any validity. Even if you have 16,000 sources saying the same thing, that only confirms that there are 16,000 crazy people agreeing with each other. The most you can say is, wow, people really did think Jesus was God at the time. Yes, no shit. We already knew that. People thinking Jesus is God does not make him God. If it did, there would be no need to write this book. A lot of this book focuses on evidence for Jesus' existence. Aside from the self-congratulatory, circle-jerking interview routine, I don't have a problem with this. It certainly seems like there's good enough evidence for a guy named Jesus to have existed. But really, whether Jesus existed has no bearing on whether someone is an atheist. Look at it this way. I'm sure Christians accept the fact that Muhammad was a real person. But are they Muslim? Nope. Making claims of a person's existence is entirely different from making claims of a person's divine power, which, honestly, you just can't do logically. If there's documentation of a person doing impossible things, such as walking on water, the rational explanation is either that the person who wrote it is mixing fiction with fact, or what they saw happened, but they mistook it for a supernatural event that in reality has a reasonable explanation. Think of magicians. When you watch a magician, you don't understand how they did what they did, so it seems like magic. But of course it's not real magic. It's a performance arranged in such a way as to deceive you. You can be deceived like this today and be baffled by it. Imagine this same type of thing happening 2,000 years ago in a society with very limited understanding of the physical world. Of course they'd chalk it up to magic or divine power. But to accept that an impossible act happened just because people who believed that it happened wrote it down is absurd. Truthfully, this historical accuracy thing is something that all founders of religion know. If you're going to start a religion, the smart thing to do is to include a lot of historical accuracy along with your made-up bullshit. If you find claims of supernatural events in historical records, it does not mean those supernatural events really happened. All it means is that the people who wrote those things were just as irrational as the people who currently believe them. Please, for the love of existence, interview someone who doesn't believe in God, and then show the reader the mistakes they made or why they're wrong. This book is completely one-sided. Since he's attempting to come from the angle of a skeptic or an unbiased person, you would expect him to interview at least one non-religious expert. To be fair, he does bring up the claims of atheist scholars and asks his theist scholars what they think about them, but never does he actually interview an atheist scholar. He asks his interviewees if they've ever encountered any reliable information that would contradict the Bible, and of course, they say no. But look who he's asking! How could a scholar devoted to Christianity admit that his basis for faith is flawed? So of course he believes that it isn't. I'm not saying that all people trying to push an agenda should provide evidence that contradicts their own side, but if this really is a pursuit of the truth with the starting point of undecided, then wouldn't you investigate both sides of the argument? That way you can find out which side has the stronger case? Lee Strobel likes to begin each chapter with a criminal case that somehow relates to the topic of the chapter, which are actually the most enjoyable parts of the book. So he's trying to compare what he's doing to a trial. The book is even called The Case for Christ. In a trial, there are two sides who both present their arguments and let the jury decide. But in this book, there's only the jury and the defendant, but no prosecutor. He might be trying to present himself as the prosecutor, but in reality, he's more like the defense lawyer questioning his own client. One specific instance that was nearly too illogical for words was in Chapter 5. Archaeologist Dr. John McRae, who overall had far fewer convincing arguments than the previous experts, says the burden of proof should be on those who dispute the existence of Nazareth. This is exactly the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. He couldn't provide evidence to support his claim that Nazareth did exist during the time of Jesus, and even Lee Strobel seems to think so. So then he says the atheists has to prove that Nazareth didn't exist. How do you figure the burden of proof is on the person who claims non-existence? If there is a lack of evidence for a thing, the burden of proof is on the person who claims that thing does exist, to find evidence for it. Not on the person who says it doesn't. What would they even do? You assume a thing doesn't exist until evidence is provided for it. Not the other way around. If I make a claim that invisible cats don't exist, the burden of proof is on you to show that they do, even if I'm the first one to make a claim about them, because there isn't any evidence for them. In Chapter 6, The Rebuttal Evidence, Strobel was talking about how you need to hear out the other's side. So I thought he was finally going to interview an atheist scholar. He didn't. He interviewed a religious scholar, about critiques to the veracity of the claims of Jesus that some scholars have made. He put in some effort to address the claims of atheists, as he's done the whole book, but still, he's playing the role of the defense attorney, not the prosecutor. It's abundantly clear that he's giving the theistic side preferential treatment while trying to seem like he's not. Dr. Gregory Boyd's problem with the Jesus seminar doesn't really make any sense. He's upset that they're coming at the Bible from a naturalistic angle. Miracles don't happen because the world is run by the laws of physics, and for miracles to happen, that would break those laws. They rule out things that just don't make any sense, and then look at the evidence from there. He accuses them of coming up with skewed and biased results because of this. But what does he do? He accepts the supernatural at face value, even though it contradicts everything about how the world works. He even says it's a tremendous presumption to think we know enough about the universe to say that God can never break into our world in a supernatural way. But apparently he doesn't realize that the opposite is also a tremendous presumption. In fact, an even bigger one. A quick, unrelated tangent. A gigantic presumption that Christians and other religious people don't know they're making is that they presume to know God. Perhaps not completely, but how presumptuous is it to think that you know what the creator of the universe is like and what he wants? And how much more presumptuous is it to think that he cares personally about your life? It may also be presumptuous to think you know that there is no God, sure, which is why the least presumptuous and most humble option seems to me to be agnosticism. I have no idea if there's a God. How could I possibly come to a decisive conclusion? An agnostic might have suspicions. You don't know if there's a God, but there probably isn't one. But still, this isn't a declarative statement about something that you honestly can't claim knowledge of. What one side is doing is saying, every single thing that I or anyone I know has ever observed has a naturalistic explanation, and you don't need supernatural events for the world to make sense, so when someone makes a supernatural claim, it can be dismissed. And the other side is rejecting that in favor of just believing in supernatural claims, but only those having to do with their chosen religion. The naturalists are basically saying, every single swan we've ever seen has been white. This may not be enough to say conclusively that all swans are white, but until we see one that isn't, it's a pretty reliable rule. And the supernaturalists are saying, we believe in black swans. Okay, that's interesting. Could you show us a black swan? Well, we don't actually have one to show you, but we've got reports of black swans, and we believe those reports. Can you be certain those reports are accurate? They very easily could have seen a different blackbird and mistook it for a swan, or a white swan covered in tar, or they were delusional, or lying. No. They're most definitely real black swans. You simply have to trust us. Okay, how about reports of pink swans? We've got a few of those, but don't have evidence. Do you also believe in those? Pink swans? That's nothing but foul trickery and lies. Pink swans are supernatural stories from other religions. This analogy isn't perfect because there's no physical reason that would make the existence of black swans unbelievable. So a person who's never seen a black swan might reasonably suspect that black swans do exist somewhere if they've gotten reports about them, because swans being black doesn't contradict how the world functions. If these reports were about swans who can shoot laser beams out their eyes or make portals to other dimensions, that would be something you couldn't just believe because other people claim that it exists. In a similar vein, there's plenty of historical depictions and tales of dragons, but we don't believe dragons ever actually existed. The whole problem is this. Most people usually have a high level of scrutiny about things, a certain amount of skepticism. This is good and natural. You tell someone about dragons, they probably don't believe you. But then for certain topics, people completely remove their standard level of skepticism. You tell them about alien abductions, that's absurd. But you tell them about the resurrection of Jesus, and for some reason, that's completely believable. What happened to your rationality from one moment to the next? Shouldn't we hold all things to the same amount of scrutiny? You could be open-minded to the possibility of the supernatural at the outset of your investigation, because it might turn out to be a further discovery of how the world works. But this is very different from actually accepting supernatural explanations. This is exactly what science does. The first person who heard about ball lightning probably thought the person who saw it was nuts. But rather than rule it out right away, you investigate and find out that it actually does happen and can be explained. And that explanation isn't a supernatural one. There's something contradictory about the whole premise of this book, aside from the disingenuous angle of the author. Being a Christian is about having faith. Having faith is not about providing evidence. In fact, It's about believing despite a lack of evidence. If there were evidence, it wouldn't be faith anymore. It would just be an acknowledgement. The desire of Christians to refute atheism with their supposed evidence of Christianity completely undermines their own claims about the importance of faith. This entire book is an example of that. Do you want to have faith or do you want to have facts? Because you can't have both. That's not to say you can't have any facts. You could have historical facts, like showing that Jesus was a guy who lived, but as soon as you collect facts that prove the divinity of Jesus, there can be no more faith about it. And providing facts about a historical Jesus does nothing to convince a skeptic that Jesus was the Son of God. That takes a Kierkegaardian leap into the absurd. There's a claim in this book that if the Jesus of faith is not also the Jesus of history, he's powerless and he's meaningless. Unless he's rooted in reality, unless he established his divinity by rising from the dead, he's just a feel-good symbol who's as irrelevant as Santa Claus. What logic is this? Why does Jesus have to actually have been resurrected for him to be meaningful? You could still live your life by the teachings of Jesus without believing in God, but because you think he was a guy with good ideas. Does Martin Luther King mean nothing? Does Nelson Mandela mean nothing? Do Socrates or Abraham Lincoln or Shakespeare mean nothing? None of them were the Son of God, but they still stood for certain ideas that we can look up to today. Your morality and your hope and your joy of life don't have to come from believing in the supernatural. Stories teach us about morality, and they don't have to be religious stories. Dr. Ben Witherington III makes a statement that works against his own cause. He says, "We have to ask, why is there no other first-century Jew who has millions of followers today? Why isn't there a John the Baptist movement? Why, of all first-century figures, including the Roman emperors, is Jesus still worshipped today, while the others have crumbled into the dust of history? It's because this Jesus, the historical Jesus, is also the living Lord. That's why. It's because he's still around, while the others are long gone." Using this kind of logic, we should also ask, why is Muhammad such a prominent figure today? Is it because he really was who he said he was? Or would Witherington come up with some other reason for Muhammad coming out on top as the most celebrated figure of his time? I'm aware that the argument A proves B is not the same as B proves A. I know he's saying that Jesus lasted the test of time because he really was God, and not that Jesus really was God because he lasted the test of time. But still, a person being a more important figure than other people of their time has nothing to do in one direction or the other with if they actually were God, but if other people believed them to be God. And I'm sure that even Christians would acknowledge that a large devotional following does not provide legitimacy. Otherwise, they would be compelled to accept other religions as valid. In the beginning of chapter 8, Lee Strobel uses an example that is just too rich. It's a perfect analogy, and yet he thinks it's providing a point that benefits his argument. The chapter is about whether Jesus was crazy. In his usual fashion, he makes an analogy to a trial. I'll read you exactly what he says. "I recall a case in which a mild-mannered housewife stood accused of murdering her husband. At first glance, she appeared no different from anybody's mother. Well-dressed, pleasant, kindly, looking as if she had just emerged from baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies for the neighborhood children. I scoffed when a psychologist testified she was mentally unable to stand trial. Then her lawyer put her on the witness stand. Initially, her testimony was clear, rational, and lucid. However, slowly it became more and more bizarre as she described, calmly and with great seriousness, how she had been assaulted by a succession of famous individuals, including Dwight Eisenhower and the ghost of Napoleon. By the time she finished, nobody in the courtroom doubted that she was totally out of touch with reality. The judge committed her to a mental institution until she was well enough to face the charges against her. Looks can be deceiving. It's the psychologist's job to peer beneath the defendant's veneer and draw conclusions concerning his or her mental condition. It's an inexact science, which means mistakes and even abuses can occur, but overall, psychological testimony provides important safeguards for defendants. How does all this relate to Jesus? In the preceding chapter, Dr. Ben Witherington III offered convincing evidence that even the earliest material about Jesus showed he was claiming to be God incarnate. That naturally raises the issue of whether Jesus was crazy when he made those assertions. I appreciate that he decided to even suggest that Jesus could be crazy. But do you see how clearly his analogy works against him? His own example of insanity is someone who thinks they have a relationship with famous dead people. That's exactly what Christians are. Why is it any more absurd to believe that the ghost of Napoleon is visiting you than that Jesus is watching over you, or that you can talk to him, or that he's still alive today? Of course, any Christian will automatically disagree with me, but I find it amusing that a Christian psychologist is who Lee Strobel relies on to determine if Jesus was insane or not. Just think about it. Somebody who believes the Bible literally, judging whether somebody else is insane. An insane person relied upon to determine somebody else's sanity. Of course, there's a difference between classic schizophrenic insanity and being a Christian. But Christians are certainly also out of touch with reality. You might object and say that being religious isn't in the DSM-5, so it's not a mental disorder. I would have to strongly disagree. When one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it's called religion. This very book says, experts say that people suffering from delusional psychosis may appear rational much of the time, yet can have grandiose beliefs that they are superlative individuals. He was referring to Jesus, but we could extrapolate that the same is true even when it's not about delusions of your own grandeur. And it's not that people have to be obviously and immediately insane in order to be classified as having a mental problem. Religious belief certainly belongs in the DSM-5, but there are so many people suffering from it that they would not allow it to be put in. And non-religious psychologists don't want to insult billions of people. But think about it this way. Just because everyone is doing something doesn't make that thing reasonable. Slavery used to be legal and normal, but that didn't make it reasonable. Misogyny used to be legal and normal. I mean, it's still legal, but that doesn't make it reasonable. Religious belief is certainly legal and normal, but that doesn't make it reasonable. One can only hope that someday in the future we'll find the mental clarity as a species to view belief in Christianity the same way we currently view belief in Zeus or in the ghost of Napoleon. If you knew someone who seriously worshipped the Olympian gods, you would probably think that person is either quite stupid or quite insane, or both. In Chapter 8, Dr. Collins says, "It's just amazing to me how people will grasp at anything to try to disprove Jesus' miracles." Well, Dr. Collins, I find just the opposite amazing. It's amazing that people will accept incredibly unlikely events at face value just because they want to believe them. It's amazing that people will grasp at anything to try to prove Jesus' miracles. A page later, he says, "To some degree, you find what you set out to find." He has no idea how true this is. He says, when talking about demonic possession, "People who deny the existence of the supernatural will find some way, no matter how far-fetched, to explain a situation apart from the demonic." Just the opposite is also true, and that's the category he falls into. People who depend on the existence of the supernatural will find some way, no matter how far-fetched, to explain a situation in terms of the demonic. Of these two options, I find the first a far better route to follow. But there is a third option. Not outright denying the possibility of the supernatural, but allowing for its possibility while being highly skeptical about it. For instance, if we live in a computer-generated simulation, it's entirely possible that beings who function similarly to demons exist. The difference is, I need some evidence of that. An exorcist cannot produce evidence that demons exist. There are certainly cases of strange psychological issues that religious people would like to classify as demonic possession, but just because science doesn't currently understand a thing doesn't make that thing supernatural. All it means is that our current understanding of psychology is not good enough yet. And every psychologist would agree with that. To set your default to ascribing things to the supernatural when there isn't a good explanation for them is irrational. What's wrong with simply saying, "I don't know"? Why do religious people feel the need to know the unknown? Dr. Collins even mentions how these two ends of the spectrum exist and are problematic. But he doesn't realize that he's on one end. He asks, well, how else could you explain Jesus sending demons into pigs and the pigs running off a cliff? I don't know, maybe it didn't happen at all. But if you've already convinced yourself that the Bible is infallible, then you've got to come to some pretty ridiculous conclusions in order to make sense of it. I was glad to hear Dr. Donald A. Carson refer to God as formless and bodiless, which would suggest that he doesn't view God as anthropomorphic, some bearded man in white robes. The personification of God has always been an issue with me. I find it far more probable that if there is a God, God is essentially just the universe, or nature, or a force in existence, rather than a being who looks like a man. It seems to me that most deep thinkers on the subject of God see God as more of an idea, like absolute truth, than a man-like God. So it really irritates me when people try to sell God in a package that they don't really even believe in. Theologians always seem to respond to criticism of the Bible by saying, but but if you translate this passage correctly, it means this. And now it makes perfect sense with what I'm saying. How convenient this always is. But I've got to wonder, why isn't the Bible translated correctly? Isn't the Bible translated by Christian scholars who care about these things? Isn't it problematic that the Bible civilians are reading portrays a different meaning than what the scholars prefer? Doesn't that take at least some of the credibility and the consistency out of the Bible if it's an interpretation game? For instance, Dr. Carson says that the phrase, his only begotten son, that appears in the King James Version of the Bible should actually be unique one, or the one and only son, according to the word in Greek. But why wouldn't all Bibles say this if it's true? It seems to me that biblical scholars always have to twist the words in the Bible to shape it according to the argument of the time. Just look at the Greek text and find a synonym that roughly fits your point. If unique one is what was meant, then why isn't that what's taught in church? In chapter 9, Dr. Carson tries to make an argument for the existence of hell. Basically, he's saying that you would expect a God who created the universe to cast judgment on those who defy him. If he didn't, and didn't care about immorality, then he wouldn't be a God to be admired. He wouldn't be moral himself. But Carson doesn't seem to understand that negative motivation isn't necessary, and you would think a God could figure that out. The absence of positive motivation could also serve as a judgment. Rather than sending people to hell for an eternity of torture, God could simply remove sinners from existence when they die. The good people get infinite reward, the bad people get deleted. Hell's existence is enough to make me lose any admiration for God. In the introduction, Lee Strobel says, "In this quest for truth, I've used my experience as a legal affairs journalist to look at numerous categories of proof. Eyewitness evidence, documentary evidence, corroborating evidence, rebuttal evidence, scientific evidence, psychological evidence, circumstantial evidence, and, yes, even fingerprint evidence." That sounds intriguing, doesn't it? Yes, Lee, that does sound intriguing. He mentions fingerprint evidence to entice the reader. You probably think, fingerprint evidence? This was 2,000 years ago. Are there really fingerprints left over? Did someone collect Jesus' fingerprints somehow? And after 180 pages of reading, you finally get to the fingerprint evidence chapter, only to find out that Lee Strobel pulled the old bait and switch. It's figurative fingerprint evidence. It has nothing to do with fingerprints, but with prophecy. The chapter is about whether Jesus fulfills the prophecies of the Messiah, which is about as useful as a horoscope. Alright, let's see. Today's horoscope. I'm a Virgo. Action is the key word for you today, Virgo. So put on some comfortable shoes and have a good time. And fuse a bit of non-sequitur playfulness in your dealings with others. Find ways to escape reality for a little while. Take the original scenario and add a twist of the bizarre. Opinions will be especially strong today, and conflict may arise, but realize that playfulness and lightheartedness will help any situation. Great. Really insightful. Ultimately, this book is not actually written to convince atheists. It's written to confirm the beliefs of Christians. He only interviews Christians. It's only confirming preconceived notions, which is a hallmark of pseudoscience. There's no real efforts to disconfirm religious theories, which is what scientists do. They form a specific hypothesis based on an observation, then attempt to test it by seeing if they or anyone else can prove it wrong, and when they can't, they call it a theory and rely on it as truth until it gets disproven. But this is not what religions do. In chapter 10, Lee Strobel interviews Louis S. Lapidus. Maybe it's Louis, I'm not sure. He says, for Lapidus, the question of whether Jesus is the long-anticipated Messiah goes beyond theory. It's intensely personal. I think Lee Strobel is trying to make that sound like a good thing. That's not a good thing. If anybody is trying to sell me on an idea that they have an intense personal connection to, I'm going to take everything they say with about 6 pounds of salt. When it's intensely personal, that's where the greatest bias shows up. If someone survives cancer, and they tell me a long, detailed, emotional story of how they did it thanks to essential oils, or God, or a vegan diet, I'm going to be extremely skeptical, and certainly won't believe that essential oils cure cancer just because they said so. There's hundreds of things that they might not be accounting for in their story, and essential oils is, for whatever reason, the thing they believe helped them. It's endlessly amusing to me that Christian scholars view alternative theories of what happened to Jesus on the cross, or anywhere else, like that he didn't die, or that he did die and never came back to life, or maybe that he had a secret twin, as absurdly improbable. Like they're somehow less probable than someone dying and coming back to life and then levitating up into heaven. You believe that, but find the suggestion that Jesus was drugged on the cross and woke up later when he was presumed to be dead to be less believable? Or maybe that it wasn't Jesus on the cross. Of course, I'll admit that if Jesus was whipped and crucified and all that, it's very improbable that he didn't die. But the most improbable thing of all is coming back from the grave. In chapter 11, there's a quote, "Clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge." You know what else is at odds with modern medical knowledge? Spontaneous resurrection. It's amazing how Christians turn to science when it suits them, but then reject it when it suits them. A little bit later in the book, this implausibility thing actually gets addressed. That alternate theories might be implausible, but they're more plausible than spontaneous resurrection. One of the interviewed scholars, Dr. Craig, brings this up. He says, any hypothesis would be more probable than saying the corpse of Jesus spontaneously came back to life. But he thinks God raising Jesus from the dead is different. I would argue that's already what I meant when I imagined spontaneous resurrection. God doing it or not, it's incredibly unlikely either way. He says, as long as the existence of God is even possible, it's possible that he acted in history by raising Jesus from the dead. It's possible that we live in the eye of a blue-eyed giant named Macumba. It's also possible that people believe all sorts of crazy things with enough conviction to get other people to believe them too. It's possible that Jesus' body was stolen from the tomb or never placed there. It's possible that Joseph of Arimathea had some plans of his own and purposely left Jesus' tomb empty to create rumors and work against the Roman government. After all, he was the only member of the Council of Sanhedrin that was absent when they voted to have Jesus killed. The existence of God might be possible, but the existence of the Christian God? The existence of a God who personally intervenes on humanity's behalf? With every detail you add to make this possible God fit your religion, it becomes more and more unlikely, to the point where it would be silly to believe in Jesus' resurrection based on the fact that his followers said it happened. These are people who already believed Jesus to be the Son of God. Of course they'll believe whatever they want. There are plenty of times when one of these scholars Lee Strobel interviewed provides some plausible reasoning for some historical basis in the Bible. Usually, that's fine. I don't think anyone's got a problem saying that the Bible isn't at least loosely based in fact. But there are other occasions in this book where the scholar doesn't actually answer the question, or provides bad reasoning, and it goes unnoticed, or it gets accepted as a good argument by Strobel. I'll give you one example. He asks Dr. Craig about the reliability of the testimony of the woman who saw Jesus' tomb was empty, because they were his friends and followers. Craig responds with an argument about how the women really were there, and really did report this, because women were treated poorly and not allowed to serve as legal witnesses. So the fact that they're being used as a source is proof that they were really there, because they would have liked to make up a better source if they were making things up. Sure, we could accept that reasoning. But it has nothing to do with the reliability of the woman, if they were being honest with what they were saying. Them telling everybody that Jesus' tomb was empty doesn't prove that they weren't delusional or lying when they said it. A pattern that comes up a lot in religious belief is people believing because it helps them ease the pain of loss. Or at the very least, that loss strengthens their belief. Sometimes it works the other way. Someone has a child die and they can no longer believe in a God that would do that to them. But when the reverse happens, when they cling on to Christianity even harder after a death, it becomes basically impossible for logic to ever reach them again. They've become compromised. Dr. Gary Habermas, whatever, the scholar who was interviewed to talk about why you should believe in the resurrection of Jesus, tells a little story in the end of the chapter about how his wife died in 1995. He says Jesus' resurrection is what got him through it, that it's the answer. I'm pretty sure this was included in the book to be supplementary, to give the reader further reason to believe. It does the opposite. It makes Habermas lose credibility. He has personal reasons to delude himself and others. If he no longer believed in the resurrection of Jesus, how would he continue to cope with the death of his wife? He's been emotionally and logically compromised. Another thing that Habermas, and Lee talked about that I can't help but poking at is the 500 witnesses in 1 Corinthians. Habermas tries to paint the 500 people seeing the resurrected Jesus as being credible. He says Paul wouldn't lie about this, because at the time you could go and ask these 500 people if they really saw Jesus. But the thing is, there are no names. It's just an assertion of 500 people. Who are these people? How was anybody supposed to fact check this if they didn't know who to ask? It's completely ridiculous. So 500 unnamed people saw Jesus, and the other people Jesus appeared to before blasting off into heaven were his followers and friends. Awfully convenient. Dr. J.P. Moreland's circumstantial evidence, is all pretty dubious. His first supporting fact to prove the truth of Jesus' resurrection is that the disciples died for their beliefs. There are plenty of people all over that die for things that aren't literally true. There always have been. His second reason is that skeptics, like Paul and Jesus' brother, would have no reason to convert and die for their faith if it didn't actually happen. Once again, this is just silly. Someone converting to a belief system and sticking to it doesn't validate that belief system. There are plenty of people today who go from atheist to Christian and they didn't see Jesus. Same goes for Paul and James. The third reason is that thousands of Jews abandoned their traditions to adopt Christian ones. He says they wouldn't risk damnation and persecution for no good reason. A large amount of people following a belief system doesn't mean that belief system is true. And it's important to note that these people were Jews. They had already been facing persecution for hundreds of years. So some of them changed their ways and are targets of persecution. But they already were targets of persecution. They already had traditions seeped in superstition, like a yearly animal sacrifice to appease God. They're still doing the same thing at the heart of it, putting themselves at risk by practicing downright strange traditions for no good reason. Now it's just that Jesus stands in for the animals being sacrificed, and they pretend to drink his blood and eat his flesh. That's completely normal. His other reasons are similar. Culture changed quickly afterward. This is certainly evidence that the apostles were influential and effective at spreading ideas, and that people were generally not independent thinkers. It's not evidence for the authenticity of their claims. Just look at the world we live in. There are tens of thousands of people who really believe the earth is flat. They think they have proof of this. This is an idea that spread very quickly. In 2010, there was barely a whisper on the wind of anybody believing the earth was flat. I'm sure you could find people on internet forums on fringe websites, but you'd really have to go looking for it. And now, you don't have to look at all. Whatever the belief is, there are always people who believe insane things. Christianity is one of those. So overall, the case for Christ is not convincing. It's a book that tries to look like that it was written by a skeptic seeking the truth, when really it was written by a Christian seeking confirmation. Lee Strobel tries to say he honestly and carefully sifted through all the information available. He didn't. Plus, one thing you've got to consider, he went on his journey into Christianity after his wife became a Christian. So what was he to do? He could remain an atheist and go the rest of his life no longer being able to relate to his wife, perhaps thinking that she's crazy or that she's been duped. He could argue with her all the time about it. He could leave her, or he could become a Christian like her. He was in love with her. She is his wife. Is his rationality really more important to him than their relationship? Probably not. And for a bonus, he can believe that he kept his rationality intact. That about ends my video. Of course, there's more I could say about this book, but I'll leave it here. If you're interested, read this book for yourself. Thanks for watching or listening to this video. If you enjoyed it, maybe you could subscribe to my channel. That would be really helpful. You could also send this video or any of my other ones to a friend. See you next time, and have a great day.